Hello and welcome to our series of Proprietarian lectures, hosted this time from the Ukraine, Britannia. Hope I got that right. Yeah, I am Rich Turpin, and today I'm going to be discussing about two concepts crucial to proprietarianism: reciprocity and market change. I'm using through the lens though to discuss this. We're going to be looking at the time frame 284 to 1200 AD as a rough time frame. I'd like to, start off the idea of how things used to be very similar in the olden day in the Roman Empire to today's world. So example, I remember hearing a quote and it was saying that people could travel along the roads, merchants, military people, even tourism were operating in the Roman Empire there. We had this thing whereby you could travel all the way from Britain, all the way to the Middle East, and you could use in theory Greek or Latin and anybody could understand you. We've got a vibrant economy whereby we've got increased economic activity in this time. But how do we go from, this thing that looks very similar to today to the Dark Ages? The idea is in the reign, we have something called the crisis of the 3rd century. What happens in this is barbarian invasions on the fringes of the empire begin really testing the ability for the government to raise taxes. We've got an increase in some areas of up to 50%. So normally the Roman Empire in its heyday didn't have that many troops for the land it actually used to occupy. By the end of the 3rd century crisis, the military has increased and its expenditure by 50%. We've also got a problem whereby we've got this issue of succession. We have a time where there's literally reigns of several emperors within a few years. What this begins to do very quickly is to radically reduce the ability of the government, whereby beforehand we were able to pay for big military expenditures. Now these simple things are crippling the economy. Also, like I say, in this crisis 3rd century, we have, it's like an interlaced civil war, and what this has the knock-on effect to doing is big urban centres, which Rome was renowned for, big city centres, began failing. Now, not all of them did, some were still operating, but we find that places that used to be vibrant for trade are now gone. The people, it's been depopulated, they've moved elsewhere. So we get this big thing where there was a vibrant trade network gets radically reduced. We've also got a problem as well whereby to pay for this army, and this is the crucial part, they end up doing something called debasing currencies. Now this is, you could argue this happens today as well, where governments mess around with the money. In the Roman Empire day, it was gold, silver and copper. And predominantly silver was the way of paying people. The government found it pretty profitable because of the expenditure, just to cut the coins a bit, reduce the quality of the silver. Eventually we get a problem whereby at the time it seems fine, but then someone will notice, somewhere along the production line, someone will begin figuring out the money's not worth the same. So what begins happening in Rome, any money that is left, so example, the case in point of let's say I'm selling you tomatoes. If the price is constantly changing, and remember, like you said, the only tomatoes I can provide for you will be the least quality ones. Yet in a black market, I can get you the better ones for a little bit more. So what begins happening is people begin hoarding the good money and in turn selling bad product, because that's the only way of balancing this. What begins happening as well, so that's like a little bit of why the economy is already a bit shaky now. What also happens is the restructuring of the Roman Empire with Diocletian. It goes from being governors, people who are capable administrators, to then, because of the barbarian invasions, we've also got, like you said, this interlaced civil war in the Roman Empire. It becomes militarized. So we go from, like I say, governors having the final say to where now it's the military guys, the general having the say. One of the aspects of this economic knock-on effect of currency not being worth anything as well is that as time goes on, eventually money actually just becomes defunct in many an area. So what happens is people who used to be profitable, they used to have their own house, they used to have their own business, now in a situation where I have absolutely nothing at all. Absolutely nothing at all at the end of it. What happened is that people then began, how would you call it now, seeking a patron was the only way of surviving in the Roman Empire. So for instance, let's say I've got a business, I've got a market, but this knock-on effect of the economy affects me. I'm going to be left with nothing. So what do? I have to then go to a villa or to a Roman soldier who's got the ability to provide for me. And then I will pledge myself to him in the sense of, right, I will work for you, you'll provide me with a house, and I'll work your fields. So example, you had sharecropping, whereby, and it depends, some people are saying it were 1/10 you give to the Lord, other times in history it seems to be over half you're giving. So that this is like, in a sense, it's called coloni, is the Roman terminology, and it's not like we think of a colonist today going out and settling new land. These people would like live, there'd be like a villa or a central location, a fort. People would congregate around it where they didn't normally. So they'd moved from the depopulated cities and then to the rural areas. In the process of all this in the homage system, well, the patron system, you can't move from your location. You become bound to the land. And this is crucial for the Roman Empire, because in order to get money for the state, it involved taxing people. Now, if these people are leaving areas, then you can't keep your tax base going. We also find as well is in order to stop people from moving, they even make trades hereditary. So if I'm a carpenter, my son will have to be one. And likewise, we can't leave this area unless we pay an exorbitant fee to release us from his land. Like I said, this is the beginning of what we seem to see in the later period of the Dark Ages. This is serfdom beginning. So there's two ways of looking at it. There's the Roman angle of where the original kernel began in 284. And obviously it develops over time. Crucial thing here is, like you say, you cannot move from your land. But the thing is as well, though, you do have a house, which is, in a sense, today, for instance, try and get on the housing market, try and acquire property and stuff. Quite, you know, a lot of money for an house back then, but they were willing to give you because there were so few people around, it was so depopulated. Land became worth less than goods. So I've seen extracts where someone were paying for a donkey or a mule, and they were literally willing to trade a vineyard for a donkey. Now, can you imagine that today, audience, whereby like your house is worth less than your car, or it's worth less than a horse or something? It won't happen. This imbalance in the system because of depopulation and being tied to land makes it so whereby, like I say, land isn't worth that much, but the actual move, because example, the word in feudalism, the raw word of it, means transferable money, and that originally meant cattle. So that's where like our word comes from. It means in lieu of money. So instead of, like I say, the money's collapsed now. So what do? Well, I've got a garrison of soldiers who need feeding and paying. What happens is the local people, instead of me paying money to these soldiers, we're actually paying them in kind. We're producing food, producing leather, whatever the soldiers need, we're producing, and then we're giving it to them under the ground, under the guise of that we're receiving protection. One of the issues of this as well is because it's I mean, it's a free, how would you call it now? You have the ability you have your own sovereignty as a human. The idea is with a homage system, it implies that you're free in order for me to pledge myself to someone else. A slave is just bought and sold. They don't have a say in it. But me, even though I have nothing, I still have my mind, and I can turn around to someone and say, well, it's better working for you. Obviously, not like today's terms and conditions. It meant you love everything your Lord loves. You hate everything he hates. And he'll summon you to do things and you will do them. Again, it's like a one-way relationship, but to be honest with you, there's a guy with money and he's willing to provide you with food. It's pretty obvious. So like we were saying, there is, in the Roman Empire phase, you get the militarization of society. So we have two things going on here. We have, as the Roman Empire is beginning to unravel and collapse, we have some Romano people, Roman people, but we also have barbarians in the role of being the military commanders. So we get civilization appearing in three places. We have it around the villa, which becomes the basis of the manorial system. Now, this is the thing, don't confuse feudalism and manorialism. Manorialism is the economic unit. Feudalism is the system, the political system. People sometimes confuse the two because we find manorialism, like I say, begins in 284. It actually extends all the way to like some parts of the world, like in Russia and places. They abolished serfdom quite late. So in a sense, we've still got serfdom existing all the way up to like in some countries, 1840 odd. I think Germany outlawed it then officially. So we've got, like I said, the manorial villa system where there was a villa owner, he had protection, people would congregate around that. We also have a few surviving military forts with military commanders there. That becomes the nucleus of what we think of a castle, whereby, and the idea is with each of these things, each one will have like a draw. So for instance, people in the cities who used to have a trade, let's say you were a metal worker, you might think, I'm going to go and live in the castle because at least they've got secure walls. they can provide for me. So you find in each case, they become little nucleuses of their own form of civilization, sometimes task specializing. So you find like in a villa, for instance, in the manorial system, obviously it's mainly agricultural work that's going on. In the castle system, it's mainly like military endeavors. It's more of a military focus to it. We also have the third hub of civilization in this. What happened to the surviving cities in the Roman Empire? Because as we find, like you say, as the Roman Empire collapses, even though it's got military people running it, that's in the cities itself, it used to be run by a governor. Now, as the empire collapses, we get the Catholic Church stepping in, well, the Latin Church, I'm call it at this time, stepping into the boots of governors. We find, for example, Pope Gregory. Now, this is just a microcosm, but I think this is, you could extrapolate it across all the world, you know, the church world, you could argue. The cities became under control of bishops, and instead of what they did is there was no support. So what they did is, like Pope Gregory, he liquidated church money. And then with that, he actually had cash to use. With that, he paid people to farm land. And therefore, hopefully, so for example, with Rome, we went from a population of a city of 2 million to a village of 30,000. Literally, it's been depopulated. It's in the Byzantine Gothic War, it had sieged up to 5 times. Some of these urban centres really went through, like I say, we call it a radical economic reduction. That's a posh way of saying we're in a dark age now. So what happened is instead of it being the governor and relying on the Roman Empire's finances and support, it became local based. The bishop would, like I say, liquidate church money in some cases, pay people to do a job providing on grain. Pope Gregory as well, what he did is with any spare cash he had, he actually imported it. And it went from a stage of whereby Rome was starving to whereby they actually ended up as a productive city. An example Pope Gregory used, the myth goes that he wouldn't eat until every poor person had been fed. So we get a situation where people actually are looking up to these guys as signs of like moral character, something like, I'd follow that guy, he's willing to go starving, but at least have some bread. Throughout the Roman Empire as it collapses, you notice the names change, but it becomes the church instead. So instead of, like say, bishop, it's now a governor, it's now a bishop. As all the hierarchical church structure as a Roman counterpart. So in a sense, the survival of the Roman Empire, it disappears to all intents and purposes. But in the church, some aspects of this remain, such as like the ability to organise things. This is something that devolved onto the church. It originally started why the church became powerful. Prior to this, in the Hunnic invasions of 450, the emperor were nowhere to be seen. He's just like a figurehead living in Ravenna. The army's nowhere to be seen. Aetius is missing. And yet the guy who turns up and negotiates with Attila the Hun, he never had the authority to do it, was Pope Leo with a couple of senators. And this begins the process with the church of whereby they're actually stepping into the boots of like emperors. They're negotiating with powers they never had. But in the end of the day, the buck stops with them. So we get great characters, like you say, Gregory of Tours, we've got Pope Gregory, people like that. So like I said, the 3 nucleuses, we've got the manorial system with the villa, the castle, and then the city. Now, each one had its own advantages and drawbacks. Now, again, we're not talking about a complete re-establishment of the Roman Empire, but it still ticks along. Civilization is still able to go to the point where it's at least replacing itself. One of the problems throughout ancient times is, you could argue this is why we're in a dark age now, population decline. Even in the heydays of the Roman Empire, it was still, unless you had 3 kids, we're talking about wars, plagues, famines, civil wars, not a good chance all 3 kids are going to survive to an healthy age. As the Dark Ages begin, we're getting a very reduction in that. But as time goes on, eventually we do start being able to get out of the mire of lack of population. How would I put it now? These 3 systems become, like I said, the crucial pillars of what we'd recognise as medieval society. The power of the church, the power of the military organisation. I'll go into detail about how the military organisation works in the feudal system. And then the economic unit of the manor. Now, I was mentioning now about how these are like the Roman Empire aspects behind this. There is a Germanic element to it as well. So, for instance, and I'm going to use examples like the Anglo-Saxons and the Lombards. For instance, in the case of Britain as a peculiarity, most of the Roman Empire, when it collapsed, just changed hats. Like I said, in France, loads of villas. There is a few cities left, and it just changes hats to the church rather than Rome. In Britain, in their case, we have a culture that were Celtic, became Latinized. But then when Rome leaves, instead of us speaking Vulgate Latin, like the French are doing, like the Spanish, like the Italians, we go back to insular Celtic again. The Roman impress on Britain were quite small. I mean, obviously with their time, they came here, they required 3 legions to keep the island, but it were piecemeal, little settlements. Things were, mainly in the south where economic activity were more productive. Up north, we used to have shorter swords. They used to mock us because we couldn't afford the iron. You know, you short-sworded northerners. While down south, it was more continental in its focus. London's always been a big trading city. They grew flatland grain and wheat. Up north, we're cattle herders. It's very hilly and what have you. So economically up north, it's different. So like I said, in Britain, it was weird. You've got this contrasting different economic zones and Roman interest in it. As Rome goes, it's like I said, instead of us devolving to Vulgate Latin, we then have insular Celtic, but then we have invasion by Germanic people. Now, even though we know there's similarities between Celts, even Mediterranean people, the Italians and Celts are closely linguistically related. They just went down very different cultural routes. The Germanic world, it gives us a very good insight into how bad things must have been for them. So, example with the Lombards and like the Saxons, it's an army on the move, which is a bit like, so example, the entire culture, it was broken down into units of families so a family would provide for the soldier who's fighting in the war band. Now, in these Germanic cultures, the king, even though obviously he has power, he's just the first of the war band. Because in German culture, what we have is we've got the men of the spears. Now, what this means is it's anybody in our world, in the Anglo-Saxon world and the Lombard world, a free man were denoted by the fact he could carry a weapon, which made a big difference. Because like I said, the difference between slave and free meant I can have a weapon and I can choose what I do with my time. You know, I might be serving a king, but I'm choosing to do that. I'm not compelled to do it. In the gathering of the spears, what they did, and I think this is in the Anglo world, you could argue, I think this is the kernel, the beginning of what we could argue as a constitutional monarchy. Because what they do, the men of the gathering of the spears, they would select, now usually it's a guy of a distinguished lineage, but every time, even if there was a war, an assassination or whatever, this guy, whoever did it, had to come to the men of the spears and say, do you consent to me ruling it? At which point they do something that they get a shield and a spear and bang it. Now, you might think, so what's that got to do with it? Today in German culture, and you even get it like, we all go, we clap when we show approval. But in Germany, sorry, microphone, they bang on a table. And this is, the Germans are noticing, it's a link to the men of the spears. It's still strange, like I say, thousands-year-old cultural holdover. The way the world would, like I say, broken down, slave and free, there was the culture that we're talking about. This isn't like, I hate to use the word barbarian, but anybody who's a European from the north, let's face it, we are barbarian stock. This was a vicious world. It was a world where obviously war was always at the forefront of the mind. Example, the legal system, if we have a look at it, we have a concept called the Wehrgeld. Now, this is obviously the Bible also has a form of compensation. Celtic law under Brehon law had compensation. The concept, so most Indo-European groups had it. The idea of this was it mitigates violence because we're talking about families who have the right of feud, if I, let's say, kill one of you guys, it's your family's job to kill me and my family. And then the problem is one of them will take exception and it begins this horrible cycle. In order to break this, we put the price of violence as extremely high to be cost prohibitive. So if I think of killing a man, I'll think twice about this because it's going to lead to economic ruination for me, maybe even enslavement, because the way it worked is, and we used to have this concept called indentured servants. If I don't have the cash, and this is the concept of being free, I can become a slave if I want. Now, the idea in the ancient world, it was usually time limited. So, for instance, whatever debt I incurred, I would pay off. The Wehrgeld concept, like I said, its meaning means man's money, man's value. But it's not just men, it also means animals, women as well even. So what we find in the Lombard world, and again, it's again, I like using them as the example, they're like the Italian Germans. They're the Germans who invaded the Italian peninsula, like I say, while the Anglo-Saxons invaded England. I mean, the Burgundians are the same. There's a commonality between all three cultures. I can kind of look at one and see our traits in them all. In the Wergeld, specifically to women, I find this interesting. We're always assuming in the ancient world, women were valued less, or they had like less of an importance. Opposite to that. If I killed a woman or assaulted her in the Lombard system, Lombard law code, I would be susceptible to more fines than killing a man. What's that about? Well, if we think about it, it only takes one guy, like Charlemagne, to sire most of Europe's families, if you think about it. Anybody who's a European will have a descendant of Charlemagne. But women, they're the only people who can make soldiers, baby makers. So even though the culture has a lot of spiritual prohibitions against women, so one of the aspects in Lombard culture, this is the thing, if you read the Bible, witchcraft, it's no different than anything else. It's a death penalty, yeah, but it's all the same as adultery, homosexuality, fucking blasphemy even. Why is witchcraft so bad? Reason is because in the Lombard culture, they said a woman could steal your soul. She could do some spiritual misdeeds to you. Now, the argument could be, are we looking at a remnant of an ancient time when maybe women did do something wrong? Maybe there was a bad judgment decision. But in their culture, even though killing a woman is worth financially bigger penalties than a man, they still have this idea that woman potentially could be a witch, could do something bad. So we get this thing, that the idea of like witch burnings and like, oh, the church is responsible for this. No, it's strange, it's a bit of a paradox. The church were kind of like, same as any sin in our book. But the Lombard Germanic culture and Anglo-Saxon, there is this idea that women can do some witchcraft, do some mischief. This becomes quite ingrained in our culture. And again, it haunts us back in the days of the extremes when we have like fucking witch burnings. In the even as late as like 1600 in America and stuff in Salem, we're still ending up with these like, even though the church ends up backing the idea, it's really a Germanic one in its concept. Yeah, it's again the feudal system. How did, so example, all the things that we see, for instance, in like Christian version of prayer, I put my hands together. That's not how the Bible says you pray. If you read the Old Testament, it's supposed to be like Solomon, like that. Or it says you go in a closed room and do it. Now, admittedly, because we were discussing this yesterday with other people, yeah, there is an Indo-European trait of doing that as submission. But what we find is that symbol, where does that come from? So example, let's say I'm doing the pledge. Let's say I want to become that man's guy. What I do is I kneel down, put my head like that and my hands like this. Now, the idea is he can snatch both my hands and cut my head off instantly. It's the ultimate symbol of submission, the ultimate symbol of trust. What they did is, so you put your hands together, he grabs them, and if he does knight you, he either kisses you on the cheek or he touches you with a twig. It eventually became a sword as time went on. This, so in a sense, our whole Christian version of prayer and the idea of where the homage comes from, it's again a Germanic trait, and it showed the dominance of the man and it showed the submission of the vassal in doing this. The idea is in this system, the king, even though obviously he's the first amongst many, in the Lombard system, what they did is they give the king a bit of money. So like, for instance, when they were selecting a king in the Lombard system, they wanted half of the vassal's money to be given to the king, so that at least this king could at least have more power. In reality, he's just the first amongst many. That's how a lot of barbarian cultures work. It's absolutism and top-down model of government comes later on. Predominantly, that starts with the French. They're the only barbarian kingdom who has a direct line. So we get Merovac, Clovis, and then he gets replaced by the Carolingian dynasty, Charlemagne, and then eventually they get replaced by the Carpathians. They're the only barbarian tribe who genuinely try and keep a line going. Reason is, in their case, it was profitable for the nobles. Originally, the king would dole out land. So a powerful king starts off and he's got a lot of land. This gets subdivided down. We come to a point with like the vassal system that eventually the king has no land to give away, or very little. And then you find out the people he's given the land to, it becomes hereditary. So one of you guys, here, you take that square mile down road, but that'll never be mine again. Even though in theory it is mine, it becomes given to your children. This then, again, it gives you an incentive to build up the area. You know what I mean? If it's not my property, why would I invest in it? So you find in Europe all these little parcels of competing areas whereby, because it's theirs, they end up investing in it. This has the problem, though, of weakening, especially with the French kings. It gives them a very, what starts off as powerful kings, radically restricts them. We end up with the case of Charlemagne. We have the last king of France, the Merovingian dynasty, being having his head shaved. In Frankish culture, long hair was a sign of, it's also a symbol of being free. I've got various theories on why I think that is. So, for example, like in Frankish culture and Lombard culture, you pull a man's hair with one hand, that's like, not manslaughter, but like, well, there probably wasn't an intent there. You grab a man with two hands, that involves a serious penalty. So what happens in France is we have Merovingian kings, long hair, who end up being tonsured. That's one of the things in the church, like, what's the tonsure about? That's a sign of submission, cutting your hair off, and especially amongst barbarian tribes. If you do go into the church, that shows ultimate submission, that you're willing to cut off a symbol of your freedom and live like that. Now, that's how the Carolingians got rid of the Merovingian dynasty, just made them into monks. Like I said, they were the only barbarian group who do have a distinct line. In other barbarian cultures, it's the first amongst equals. The warband would appoint them. In this sense, the king is more of a reflection of the warband. He's not telling them what to do. The warband's telling him what to do. This, I think, this appears later on in Britain, for instance. We get like the Anarchy period. We get the Magna Carta period, where the lords begin wanting more of a monarch. And then this eventually, I see it as being like a parliamentary system, whereby in Britain, we're a constitutional monarchy. The king doesn't rule unless we consent to it. And he has to obey our laws. So in a sense, like our feudal system and things it leads today, a lot of these roots, again, start in the collapse of the Roman Empire in 284. And then as they progress, they then become like I say, banging on the table in Germany. That all descends from, like I said, this ancient time when things were beginning to be transitioning. Like I said, so we've talked about, like I said, the feudal structure. I'd like to mention briefly about the church in all this. Like I say, why did Christianity, because it is the big paradox, how did an anti-intellectual movement, because that's what it is, end up being the transferers of knowledge? How did these guys end up being the only people to copy down the classics? What it was in the ancient world, there were a period of whereby the ancient philosophies could only answer so much. So to a Greek, hence why they adopted Christianity, it answers the two questions. How do I live forever? And what's a perfect man? That's what the Greeks wanted to figure out more than anything. Christianity, from their point of view, answered this question. Now, the older ways of thinking, the Platonists, the various other people, they used to use scrolls to read. Now, if I'm not going to have got a piece of paper here, but if I just showed you how difficult it is, you need, for a start, as a scroll, it has to be on a massive table. You need to weight it down at two ends. It's not easy as I'm going through a scroll to find the information, especially in scrolls, because most of them don't even have spaces. It's just a continuous block of text. I can't just mark the page. So what happened is as Christianity would begin, it's quite coincidental, you could argue, there were people who used to write in shorthand, or like students who would get a wax, so they'd have a piece of wood with wax on it and you'd scribble on it. They found out that that's a very efficient way of writing, because what you can do is you can put more pieces, lace them together. You've got a simple codex. What happens in the ancient world is, at the Library of Pergamon, again, where do we get this word? The word parchment, this is funny. Parchment, French from parchemin, which is actually based upon the word Pergamon. Why is that? Because at the Library of Pergamon, he was trying to make a huge collection of scrolls and books. Problem, Alexandria and the Egyptians didn't like this idea because it was taking the monopoly away. So they refused to trade papyrus to the Library of Pergamon. So he needed to figure out a way of, well, I need my own version. They developed, very cleverly, parchment, whereby it requires getting an animal skin, stripping it down, and then you overlay it on a surface. Now, the beauty of this is, if I have a scroll, because it's made up of papyrus, there's only one side I can write on. The back side's rough. With parchment, it's not. Both sides are readable. Also, what I can do is, instead of a big scroll, I can get a book whereby I can have various pages that I can look at front and back. It's also easy. I can just put a bookmark in if I want to restart again. Also, I can categorise on a library shelf. Or what, so for example, you see in Alexandrian pictures, there's scrolls everywhere. There's no actual way of telling what's what. I can put the title of the book on there. And it was saying it, strangely enough, the Christians, because that was the way, I mean, especially like it mentions, Paul talks about, he says, bring my codices next time you're in town. So obviously in the early Christian period, books are just beginning. Like I said, it was mainly students taking notes. But the older traditional way of thinking was kept to the scrolls. They were quite, who would call the phrase, autistic. They liked staying, they didn't like change. So for instance, the Christians, as anti-intellectual as it were able to increase knowledge transfer at an amazing rate. What we find out is, and this is one of the keys to it, a lot of, like say, Roman society, it was local based in the sense of there'd be a local patrician, he might have a local god he's interested in, some diversion, but it only stayed with him. Now, it was just to a local area. And as we were saying, as we've got depopulation, we've got people moving about, some of these local ideas just go the way of the world, they're gone. You find this, for instance, with saints later in the Reformation. If the saint didn't have a global outreach, like St. George, he was probably going to be forgotten about in this period. So example like with brief mention of saints, like where did they come from? We think that as the rural areas, like you say, because now we've gone from the city predominantly to a rural-based agricultural system, there are local things in the mountains and stuff. Example like Lombardy in Italy. If you go, I heard this off a scholar who were dealing with it. He said in the early 20th century, men in northern Italy and Lombardy would walk past a tree and take their hat off and doff it. What's that all about? They used to be tree worshippers. Yet that's not far away from like Rome. This is like Italy where Catholicism began. And yet you've still got, not very far away from Rome, pagan holdovers. So what we think saints are is pagan, you find this in Mexico, for instance, all the saints are really repackaged pagan deities. And we think this is what's going on in Europe. So strangely enough, like saints appear at the same time that the old gods seem to be disappearing. An example is like in the Christmas story. Who's Father Christmas? He's actually Odin, strangely enough. So but I thought it was St. Nicholas. No, we've got maybe a real life guy, but he's been overlaid with rural cultural traditions that again are very hard to remove. Like you said, 20th century Italy, we're still doffing our hat to a tree. That just shows you this permeation it must have had in our society. Like we were saying, like I said, the church itself, what happened is there was a guy called Cassiodorus. There was two people in that time in about 550 AD. Boethius, who ends up writing something called the Consolation of Philosophy. Now, in this book, he talks about, and the only reason I'm mentioning this now is because this is colours the feudal period, the idea of the wheel of fortune. The idea is, well, Boethius, he was facing death in prison, and he thought, what does this all mean? And he had a vision of, turns out it's Athena, but it's supposed to be wisdom personified. And she makes the point to him that life's, you might be dying, but that's what makes life worth living. The fact that it's not forever, the fact that it's transitory. And he looked at life as the wheel of fortune, because it needs to have consolation from this, because he says the wheel's turning, I can't do anything about it. He finds out that it's better just to accept the fact things will change, and no matter what you do, try, like he always said, try your best, seek the good in everything. One thing he also says is, my mind is my own. You can take anything from it, but that you've still always got your thoughts. So in the Christian period, what happens is Boethius is not, even though his dad's a Christian, there's no evidence of Christianity in the philosophy, Consolation of Philosophy. Yet he ends up as Saint Boethius. The church ends up taking this guy's Consolation of Philosophy and making it into a major Christian doctrine. So instead of it being my thoughts are my own, you submit your mind to Christ. The idea is that the wheel's turning anyway, that's God's doing. So they're able to take this pagan worldview and adopt it to Christianity. The other guy I'm mentioning, Cassiodorus, I think it's such a shame that his idea didn't get fully realised, because I think this would be a very different world. He envisioned, because what it was is he was living during the Gothic Byzantine War. He'd seen cities burnt, he'd seen precious books and manuscripts gone, things that you could never ever replace. And in his own writings, you get this sense, he knows, he's the last man in Italy who speaks Latin and Greek, that time is of the essence, that the world is dying in his view. The only way he could think is get this information to small locations in the middle of nowhere. These become the monasteries. So we have like monastic orders started. I mean, obviously we have St. Benedict before that, but the whole idea of the actual transcribing of books is because of Cassiodorus. one thing, and I think it's beautiful, this, he envisions the vivarium, the place where these books are written, and he says, all men would be able to pursue their own academic pursuits. If you want to learn the Bible, if you want to learn the classics, that's fine. This isn't like later medieval thing where the classics at best might be just something they managed to get through, or like there's a little bit of Aristotelian logic. The original premise is that it's a completely biblical and a secular course. And he actually said, he envisioned that as a symbol of what he thought paradise was going to be like, which is a bit, sorry, how much time have I got? So I've got 30 minutes, I started 10 minutes later on that one. Yeah, so we have the actions of one man greatly influencing, like I said, the boot transfer. In the Christian world, what it wasn't that they were writing it because, oh, we want to gain all this knowledge, I want to learn. It became eventually a form of work. So the idea is, oh God, man, I have to write a book out. And that's the same as when grafting outside or tending the cows or the beehive. Now, when we're talking about making a book, we're not just talking about like today, we've got like technological processes, a backup, supply chains. We literally had one little community. And in that, there'll be a lot of people devoted just to getting the sheep so I can get the parchment, a guy who stretches it out over the table, the guy who prepares the individual leaves, the guy who makes the covers, the guy who actually writes it. This is a lot of, we always talk about division of labour happening in the later period. I'm sensing it in the monasteries quite early on, but it never gets a mention of the division of labour. And like you said, to make a book in itself was a monumental task. And obviously we didn't have a printing press till later. And we find that, so example, like you find it, where is it now? The monastery of Reichenau in Germany end up with more copies of, I think it's Virgil, the only copy of it. We end up, like say, Italy, it's a strange paradox. We have Cassiodorus, this is where it all begins. And yet because of the predations of the Byzantine Gothic War, the Lombard invasion, very few books are available in Italy at all. What it originally was, if there were an Italian book, it'd be sent to Reichenau, copied. The original were lost. We find the archive at Aachen, where the Frankish kings lived, Charlemagne. There was a huge repository of books there that managed to survive to the modern age. So we're actually indebted in a sense, even though these people, you could argue, got rid of our classical learning, they preserved the little that they could. And then again, what it was is, obviously, like, as long as it backed up the biblical worldview, it was okay in their view. Like you say, Aristotelian logic changes slightly. We get like kind of just trust what he says, don't look into the method. It becomes like an absolute. So yeah, so let's do you want me to wrap it up, Pam? I know we're saying time-wise. All right, because it's saying here 35 minutes. Yeah. Yeah. So right. So as we were saying, we have one thing I do want to go into though before I do kind of finish. It's saying 33 minutes. The actual peasant himself. What was life like for them? Obviously, I've seen pictures in woodcuts. Now, again, it could be propaganda. I've never seen a serf not smiling. Now, you probably think, well, wouldn't they be, oh, this is horrible, I'm working for a lord, it's horrible. They didn't have a word called feudalism. They didn't have a word called serfdom. All these words came later. So, for instance, yeah, the word serfdom is a Latin of servus. But no one viewed the world they were living in like, I'm living in the feudal system. Isn't it rubbish? Everybody, because it was such a local-based world, that was their life. Think about it from this point of view from a peasant. They even said peasants were very sectarian. The neighbours, I don't trust them people. But the pride they had in their little town, because that was their little world. And also, like you said, a serf, why would he go out and fight in a peasant levy? Why, I'm already doing your fields, Lord. Now I have to go out and fight for you. Yeah, because if I lose, you all might end up being killed and deported somewhere. This happened with the Anglo-Saxons. Normally, when a barbarian tribe came in, there was the original Roman inhabitants, coloni, who ended up becoming the serfs. So a lot of serf communities, in a sense, they were just like remnants of the Roman Empire. With the case of the Anglo-Saxons, we had a horrible plague that preceded them. But if you look at the genetic drift in the UK, it's all Anglo-Saxon. There is very, very little Celtic in the southwest. It shows on the map, it shows Wales, Cornwall, Scotland. They're the Celtic people. The rest of the UK, instead of being, in it just Anglo-Saxon overlords, no, it was a complete, I think disease played a predominant role, but they would have wiped these people out. Now, in a peasant community, like I said, why would you die and fight for your lord? Because that was your life. You had a house that he couldn't move you from. If you're a slave, I can buy and sell you, but a serf, you can't move a serf. And likewise, it's interesting because there's a way out of serfdom. in a sense. This is the upward mobility, being a champion. So let's say, for instance, we're in a big battle and my lord's there and some guy's a bit beaten up. I jump on and kill him. He could turn around and go, I'm just going to elevate you, for doing that deed. And what sometimes would happen is you would get peasants who were freed from their obligations because they'd served their lord in this manner, they'd excelled. But there were a catch to this, though. If you read some Shakespearean works, it's dishonourable to release a man who can't look after himself. So we had a situation where there's one poem, a guy saves his lord on the battlefield and he says, I'm going to free you now on the spot. And he says, that would be dishonourable of you, lord. He says, I cannot look after myself. I do not have money. I don't have a house. So in that sense, the lord would think, right, you're still a serf, but you're my serf now. You become a bondman. You might even become part of his household. What sometimes happened is again, the church, though, they didn't really like slavery that much. So they'd always encourage people, if they could, like a lord, when you're getting ready to die, write a will, let your slaves go. Or, like you said, try and release them from the bonds of obligation. Like I said, in the Anglo-Saxon world, they had, I think it was up to 20% of their population were slaves. When the Normans arrive, they don't outlaw it, but it's non-existent anymore. It's either you're a serf, because slavery, like you said, the church didn't like it. The Anglo-Saxon world, the church were more insular. It wasn't as connected to the continent as it was in previous centuries. The Normans brought them into alignment, and one of them aspects is that we're thankful the Normans were, slavery got more or less outlawed, but serfdom remained the status quo all the way up till Queen Elizabeth in 1534 or 1532. She says, yeah, we're now formally releasing all serfdom feudal obligations. It still exists, the manorial system, and it still exists in Scotland as the colliers or the cotters were eventually, like I said, everyone had their own house and a piece of land. They did clearance acts where they said, well, no, you have to have 4 kilometres of land to qualify as having a house. A lot of people didn't. So people managed to get around this. So even though it was formally abolished, it still existed in forms. And then eventually the death nail was the Enclosure Acts. Now, this is the thing. Western Europe starts off free, ends up serfdom, becomes free again. The opposite happens in Eastern Europe. And someone asked me about this, said, Rick, we need a deep dive on it. So I tried my best. It turns out that there was, like I said, the Mongolian invasions didn't help. So what we had is, example, in Poland, we have 1/3 of the population murdered or exiled. And we've got nobility. They've got land, like we said in the previous bit, we've got more land than people. We need people. So what did they do? Import Germans. And this gave Poland a bit of a crisis of identity. It's like, are we Polish? Are we German? Technically, we've got a Polish minority ruling a German population. They think that's one of the reasons in Slavic countries that serfdom were really put, how would you call it now, amped up. Because we have to get we have to unify around something. But these people have left to their own devices, the German probably. We also have, as we've already had the Black Death and everything, we've gone through that period in the 1400s. We then start actually increasing populations back to the Roman level. We get Italian cities where they're full of people again. These people need feeding. And we haven't got, like you say, in the previous thing, we had agricultural systems. All these people, once the Black Death happened and the Great Plague, well, there's like, let's say you had a peasant community of 100, there's 5 of you. You can't even work the land anymore. I'm actually going to go back to a city now and ply the trade I've got. Hence why it's, like I say, it's strange. We have the Roman Empire, people left cities to the rural areas. After the Black Death, we have people returning back to the cities. This then led to population increase and need of food. What the Slavic countries got lots of? Grain and wheat. So what happened is for their nobility, it became profitable. Enslave your population and sell the grain to the West. And that's one of the reasons why in Slavic countries, serfdom ended up, like I said, while we were enslaved, they were free. And it's almost like the mirror opposite of Western Europe. But that factored in, because of our success, the nobility of the Slavic countries took advantage of this and thought, well, there's money to be made, but in the process, people didn't fare too well. Yeah, we're about 40 minutes mark. So yeah, in conclusion, all this, like I said, we've been all over the place, but hopefully I've tried elucidating where some of our key cultural points come from. One thing I would like to mention is I think we're looking at this today again. I think we're looking at a situation whereby we've got population decline. We've got some cultures whereby we're not getting replacement ever. We've got a situation where money isn't. Now we've got cryptocurrency now and things. Remember, the Dark Age people didn't, but we're in a situation where money might end up collapsing, might end up whereby the dollar is worth nothing. How do I pay people? Example, in the Roman Empire, soldiers needed money. And sometimes if they weren't paid, they'd leave. Now, the only times they'd stay and fight, like the King Arthur legend in King Cole, is if someone married a Brit or had an incentive to stay. Because like, well, actually, I've got a villa and property here. But more often than not, Romans would go, I'm going now. I've got a family I have to look out for in Italy. I'm not staying here. There are an instance in Austria whereby on the Austrian border, there were a military fort. They sent back one of their guys. They said, we've not been paid in a month. Where's the money? Sent him back. Turns out Roman Empire's collapsed. Now, imagine this today, like the US Army in the field. Like, just stop paying you. What would them guys do? Would they come home? Would they stay? Would they form their own statelets? Would they become warlords again? I mean, obviously, like plague and famines and stuff, we're in a period now whereby, because of antibiotic use, plagues are presumably going to be on the increase. Now, the only difference with the Dark Ages that actually makes us less off better than them is that very few of us today are farmers. In America, we used to have a population whereby 90% were involved in farming. 2% today. Staggering. So even if we did have a systems collapse, we did have money going out the window, we have a militarisation of society, I think we'd feel worse than the Dark Ages. And another aspect to it, the intellectual part behind it. Like I mentioned, Cassiodorus, the last man in the Italian peninsula to speak Greek and Latin. Imagine if one of you guys around the table that was the last man in your country to know 2 languages. You know English and your own tongue. Like you can speak English. Imagine if you were the last people in your countries to do that. So we have a sad situation whereby like Isidore of Seville and Alcuin of York are classed as the cleverest men in the planet because there's no one else around. And in all this, never discount personal effort, because these men knew the cost of what they were doing. They knew if they didn't do this, it would get worse. So like I say, if you're a clever person today, keep this in mind, because you also find like in the past, intellectuals were persecuted frequently throughout the past. We're getting that again now, whereby like if you're at university, you say something that's true, if it doesn't agree with the political correct narrative, they'll throw you out. You could argue book burnings, as bad as aesthetically that is. Facebook does the same, deleting a comment. That's the exact same as burning a book. And I don't care how they view it, but that's still the same intent. So when I think audience is this, it's that as bad as it were back then, this technically we're able to get out of this. I'm just not being black-pilled. I take the view we're in one of 2 paths. It's either going to be a golden age or worse than any dark age I've ever experienced. And unlike in their day, they had a way out of this. It became the serfdom model. It's just today we couldn't even adopt serfdom if we tried, because we don't have the farming populations. And as a quick caveat, audience, before you were trying to arrest me, I am not endorsing serfdom. It got outlawed in 1959 at the UN, so I have to caveat that. I'm not endorsing serfdom, merely explain its historical context. So yeah, we're at 43 minutes. Yeah, so with all that, I hope I've explained to you how we got some of our European traditions, such as like the feudal system, peasants, what's homage about feudalism, how did the church play into this? And also, like I say, I'm not trying to leave you on a black pill, but keep that in thought. Never, ever assume that Dark Ages is something of the past. There's something that's very relevant today. By all the metrics, we're in one. People have even said, like, the population qualifies as a Dark Age. We don't have, that example in World War II. There was a British soldier captured a German soldier and were taking him back. I think it was in Crete, and he were taking him back to meet the destroyer. Along the way, they had a campfire, and the German guy quotes a stanza of one of the classics. The guy who captured him quotes the remaining thing verbatim. We don't live in that world anymore. And it's sad. The example, the Roman Empire, they used to have 1,000 intellectuals, all able to know Greek, Latin, and their own languages. That gets reduced to 2. And then them 2 aren't obviously on the same level as the previous ones. We're in a different world than it used to be. And I'm optimistic. I hope we do go to a new golden age. But it is a possibility that we could be looking at something even more darker than them days. So with that, keep that in thought, and hopefully try and strive for the better, try and strive for the golden age. So with that, I thank you. Any questions, anybody? Or are we done?